They say, rock bottom becomes the solid foundation on which you rebuild your life. But when I hit my rock bottom at 58 years old, I thought there was no foundation left to build on. My name doesn't matter anymore, but my story might matter to you. This is about the day my entire town turned their backs on me, and how an unlikely friendship with a young football player taught me that sometimes the people who save us come from the most unexpected places. It was a cold November morning in 2019 when everything I had built over decades crumbled in a single moment. I had been the town's most respected insurance agent for over 20 years. People trusted me with their most valuable possessions, their homes, their cars, their futures. But trust, I learned, is like glass. Once shattered, the pieces never fit back together the same way. The scandal that destroyed my life started with a simple mistake in paperwork that snowballed into accusations of fraud. Within hours, the local newspaper had painted me as a criminal who had been stealing from hard-working families for years. The truth was far more complicated, but truth has a way of getting lost when people are hungry for someone to blame. The rejection from my community wasn't gradual, it was swift and merciless. Mrs. Henderson, who had brought me homemade apple pies every Christmas for 15 years, crossed the street when she saw me coming. The barber who had cut my hair since I moved to town suddenly had no available appointments. Even the mailman started leaving my mail on the sidewalk instead of in the mailbox. But the cruelest cut came from my own neighbors. The Johnsons, who had been like family to us, put up a fence overnight, a clear message that we were no longer welcome in their lives. I remember standing in my front yard, watching as one by one, the lights in neighboring houses would go out whenever I appeared. It was as if I had become invisible, a ghost haunting a town that no longer acknowledged my existence. Hey, if this story is hitting close to home, drop the word resilience in the comments below. Sometimes we all need reminding that we're stronger than we think. And if you're finding value in this story, please hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to share with you. The problems at home were even worse than the public humiliation. My wife Sarah, who had stood by me through everything, was cracking under the pressure. Our marriage of 25 years was being tested in ways we never imagined. She would come home from her job at the elementary school with red, swollen eyes, telling me about the whispers in the teacher's lounge, the parents who no longer made eye contact, the principal who suggested she might want to consider a transfer to another district. Our two children, both in college, stopped calling as frequently. When they did call, the conversations were strained, filled with awkward silences and unspoken questions about whether their father was really the man they thought they knew. The isolation was suffocating. Days would pass without meaningful human interaction. I stopped going to church, not because I lost faith, but because I couldn't bear the stares and whispered conversations that would stop abruptly when I entered a room. The grocery store became a minefield of former friends who would suddenly find something fascinating about the cereal boxes when I walked down their aisle. I started shopping at odd hours, hoping to avoid the crowds, but even the teenage cashiers had heard the stories. Their polite but distant service reminded me that my reputation had poisoned even the most casual interactions. Depression settled over me, like a heavy blanket that I couldn't shake off. There were mornings when getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. The simplest tasks, making coffee, checking the mail, taking a shower, required enormous effort. I found myself sleeping 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, not because I was tired, but because sleep was the only escape from the crushing weight of shame and loneliness. Food lost its taste, colors seemed muted, and even my favorite music sounded hollow and meaningless. I was drowning in my own life, and there seemed to be no lifeline in sight. My first attempts to rebuild were pathetic failures that only deepened my despair. I tried to start a small consulting business from home, but word traveled fast in our small town, and potential clients would cancel meetings once they learned who I was. I applied for jobs in neighboring towns, but somehow my reputation had spread beyond our city limits. The internet, which had once been a tool for my business, had become my enemy, filled with articles and forum posts that painted me as a villain. Every rejection letter, every unreturned phone call, every cancelled appointment felt like another nail in the coffin of my future. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a rainy Tuesday in March, and I was sitting alone on a bench in the town park, watching the empty code playground and wondering if this was how the rest of my life would look, empty and abandoned. That's when I noticed him, a young man, probably in his early 20s. throwing a football by himself against the brick wall of the community center. He was tall, athletic, with the kind of natural grace that comes from years of training. What struck me wasn't his skill, but his persistence. He would throw the ball, catch it on the rebound, and throw it again, over and over, with a focus that was almost meditative. I must have been watching him for 20 minutes when the ball bounced off the wall at an odd angle and rolled toward my bench. Instead of just tossing it back, I stood up and threw it to him with more accuracy than I had managed in years. He caught it icily and jogged over with a smile that was genuine, the first genuine smile I had seen directed at me in months. "Nice arm," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Marcus Williams." I hesitated for a moment, wondering if he knew who I was, but his expression remained open and friendly. I'm Robert," I replied, shaking his hand and feeling something I had almost forgotten, the simple pleasure of human connection. We talked for almost an hour that day, and it was the most normal conversation I had had in months. Marcus told me he was a backup quarterback for the local college team, working on his accuracy during the off-season. He had grown up in Detroit, moved here on a football scholarship, and was studying business. What amazed me was that he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. When I mentioned my background in insurance, he didn't flinch or make excuses to leave. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about risk assessment and business planning. For the first time in months, I felt like a person again, not just a walking scandal. The next week, Marcus was back at the park, and when he saw me on the same bench, he waved me over. "Want to throw some passes?" he asked. I laughed, actually. Laughed for the first time in what felt like years. "I'm 58 years old," I told him. "I haven't thrown a football since high school." But Marcus was persistent, and before I knew it, I was running simple passing routes, feeling my body remember movements it hadn't made in decades. My throws were wobbly, and my catches were clumsy, but Marcus cheered every small success like I had just thrown a touchdown in the Super Bowl. This is where the story gets really good, folks. Sometimes the people who change our lives show up in the most unexpected ways. Make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss what happens next. Over the following weeks, our park meetings became a regular thing. Marcus would work on his drills, and I would help by running routes or just being an extra pair of hands. But more importantly, we would talk. Marcus had a way of listening that made me feel heard, really heard, for the first time in months. He didn't judge, didn't offer empty platitudes, didn't try to fix everything with simple solutions. He just listened, and sometimes that's the most powerful gift one person can give another. Slowly, I began to tell him about my situation, about the scandal, about the isolation, about the depression that had become my constant companion. What Marcus taught me about resilience wasn't found in motivational speeches or self-help books. It was demonstrated through his own story. He told me about growing up in one of Detroit's toughest neighborhoods, where gunshots were more common than birdsongs. His father had left when he was 7, and his mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Football had been his escape, but it hadn't been easy. He had been cut from his high school team twice before finally making it as a senior. Even then, college scouts had overlooked him because of his size and his school's poor reputation. The scholarship he eventually earned came after dozens of rejections and a year of playing at a community college to prove himself. The thing about getting knocked down, Marcus told me one afternoon as we sat on the grass after a particularly good throwing session, is that you get to choose how you get back up. You can get up angry, you can get up scared, or you can get up smarter, but you have to get up. His words weren't revolutionary, but coming from someone who had lived them, they carried a weight that resonated deep in my chest. I realized that I had been so focused on the unfairness of my situation that I had forgotten I still had choices to make. The changes in me were gradual but undeniable. The weekly sessions with Marcus gave me something to look forward to, a reason to get out of bed, to shower, to put on clean clothes. I started taking better care of myself, eating regular meals, going for walks on the days we didn't meet, even doing some basic exercises at home. The physical activity helped with the depression, but more importantly, having a friend, a real friend who knew my story and chose to spend time with me anyway, began to heal something deeper than just my mood. But healing isn't linear, and there were still days when the weight of my past threatened to pull me back down. One particularly difficult evening, after running into a group of former clients at the hardware store who had made their disgust clear through cold stares and whispered comments, I called Marcus in tears. I was ready to give up, ready to accept that this was just how my life would be now. Marcus drove over immediately, and we sat in my kitchen while I poured out all my frustration and pain. "You know what your problem is," he said when I finished. "You're still letting them define who you are. You're giving them power over your story." That conversation was a turning point. Marcus helped me understand that, while I couldn't control what people thought about me, I could control how I responded to their thoughts. We started working on what he called mental conditioning, the same kind of mental toughness he used in football. When negative thoughts would spiral, I learned to redirect them. When shame would threaten to overwhelm me, I practiced focusing on the present moment rather than past mistakes or future fears. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but slowly, I began to reclaim some sense of agency over my own life. The process of rebuilding my dignity was like learning to walk again after a serious injury. Every small step felt monumental. The first time I went to the grocery store during normal hours and made eye contact with someone who had shunned me, my heart raced like I was running a marathon, but I did it. The first time I attended a town council meeting to voice an opinion on a local issue, my hands shook so badly I could barely read my notes, but I did it. Each small act of courage built upon the last, creating a foundation of self-respect that no one else could take away from me. My relationship with Sarah began to improve as I became more like the man she had married. The depression that had made me withdrawn and irritable started to lift, and I was able to be present for her in ways I hadn't been in months. We started having real conversations again, not just logistics about bills and schedules, but actual discussions about our hopes, our fears, our plans for the future. She told me later that she had been grieving not just for our old life, but for the man I had become. Distant, bitter, defeated. Seeing me fight my way back to myself gave her hope that we could fight our way back to each other. The reconciliation with my children was more complicated but equally important. My son David, who was studying engineering at State, had been angry, not just about the scandal, but about how I had handled it. "Dad," he said during one of our first honest conversations in months, "I never cared if you made a mistake. What hurt was watching you disappear." My daughter Emma, always the more emotional of the two, had been scared that the father she adored was gone forever. Rebuilding their trust required me to be vulnerable in ways that didn't come naturally, to admit my failures, not just as a businessman, but as a father and husband. Marcus taught me that perspective is everything. He helped me see that while my old life was gone, that didn't mean my new life had to be worse, just different. We started talking about what I really wanted to do with the rest of my years. Not what I thought I should do or what would restore my old reputation, but what would bring me genuine satisfaction. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to dream about possibilities, rather than just obligations. My return to active participation in the community was gradual and strategic. Instead of trying to force my way back into old social circles, I looked for new ways to contribute. I started volunteering at the food bank, where my organizational skills were needed and appreciated. I began tutoring high school students in math and business, sharing knowledge without the baggage of my former profession. Slowly, I was building new relationships based on who I was becoming, not who I had been. The transformation wasn't just external, it was fundamental. The man who had been destroyed by other people's opinions had been replaced by someone who understood that true worth comes from within. The businessman who had measured success only in dollars and status had learned to value kindness, authenticity, and genuine human connection. The person who had been crushed by failure had discovered that resilience isn't about never falling down, it's about always getting back up. Marcus and I still meet at the park every week, though now we're joined by other people who have heard about our informal throwing sessions. What started as one young man helping one broken older man has become a small community of people supporting each other through various challenges. There's Janet, a widow, learning to live alone after 40 years of marriage. There's Miguel, veteran dealing with PTSD. There's Sarah, yes, my Sarah, who has become one of Marcus's biggest fans and often brings snacks for our group. Looking back now, I realize that being rejected by my town was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to discover who I really was beneath all the roles and expectations I had carried for so long. It taught me the difference between being liked and being respected, between being successful and being fulfilled. Most importantly, it brought Marcus into my life, a young man who saw potential in a broken, older man and refused to let him stay broken. The football player who rescued me didn't do it with grand gestures or dramatic interventions. He did it with consistency, with presence, with the simple act of showing up week after week and treating me like I mattered. He taught me that sometimes the most profound healing happens not through therapy or medication or major life changes, but through the quiet miracle of genuine friendship. Today, I smile more than I have in years. Not the forced, professional smile I used to wear like a mask, but real smiles that come from genuine contentment. I've learned that happiness isn't about having a perfect life, it's about finding meaning and connection, even in an imperfect one. The town that once rejected me still has people who cross the street when they see me coming, but it also has new friends who seek me out for advice, for conversation, for the simple pleasure of my company. What do you think about second chances? Have you ever had someone show up in your life when you needed them most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to hear more stories about the unexpected ways people can change each other's lives. Trust me, the next story will remind you that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just show up with a football and a willingness to listen.